So what actually connects your React components with Redux? That's what the React Redux library is for. We looked at the Redux flow on a previous slide. React Redux handles this final piece. It connects your React router components to Redux. React Redux is a companion library for Redux. It's a separate library because Redux isn't merely useful with React. Since Redux is fundamentally just a way to handle state, you can use Redux with other libraries. You could write Redux apps with React, Angular, Ember, jQuery, or plain vanilla JavaScript. For instance, if you were working in Angular, you might use ng Redux instead. That said, Redux was initially created as an alternative to Facebook's Flux, and most people today are using Redux with React. So in this course, I assume you're using Redux with React. And if you're using Redux with React, you're going to want to use the React Redux library to connect your React container components to Redux. As we just saw, React Redux ties your React components together with Redux. It consists of two core items, the provider component and the connect function. The provider component is utilized at your application's root. As you'll see, the provider component wraps your entire application. This is how the provider component attaches your app to the Redux store. Remember how I said earlier that container components aren't typically created by hand? Instead, they're created by React Redux. The connect function that's provided by React Redux generates your container components for you. Let's take a look at each of these items in more detail. The provider component attaches your application to the Redux store, so you use the provider component to wrap your application's top-level component. Now, theoretically, you don't need to use the provider component, but then you'd have to pass your store through all your components that might need it. That would be a hassle, so provider avoids this by making your store available to all your components automatically. If you're curious how this works, the provider component uses React's context to pull this off. So provider magically makes the store available to all of your container components in the application without having to pass it explicitly. You only need to use it once when you render the root component. As a side note, you might have read that context is an experimental feature that should be avoided. In short, this is true for you, the app developer, but there's nothing wrong with library authors carefully using the context to provide such functionality. React Router uses React's context as well. You can think of context as a feature for library authors, not app developers. Now let's discuss the second piece of React Redux, which is the connect function. This function wraps a component so it's connected to the Redux store. With this function, we can declare what parts of the store we'd like attached to our component as props, and we declare what actions we want to expose on props as well. Let's contrast this approach with Flux. In Flux, you wire your components to the store and component will mount. You have to do this manually. When your components are removed from the page, you need to remove the change listener that you set up and component will unmount. Finally, of course, you need to wire up a change handler that you referenced in component will mount and component will unmount. Here, the change handler is getting all authors from the store anytime the author store changes. This is boilerplate code that's required when you're working with plain Flux. But when you use Redux, this is all handled in a more terse and elegant way. Let's check it out. When you use Redux with React, you use a function called connect. This function connects your React component to the store. So the function is certainly named well. You pass connect two functions. One function that specifies the state that you want to expose to your component, and another function that specifies the actions you'd like to expose. We'll explore this more in a moment, but for now, I'd like to clarify some benefits to Redux's approach here over plain Flux. First, you don't need to write boilerplate code to subscribe and unsubscribe from your store. The connect function that comes with React Redux does that for you. Second, you don't have to utilize lifecycle methods to subscribe to your store. As we saw on the previous slide, Flux requires the use of component will mount and component will unmount. This means you can't use React's stateless functional components for your container components when you're working in Flux, because stateless functional components don't have the necessary lifecycle methods. In contrast, with Redux, nearly all your components can be stateless functional components if you like. Since they're easier to read and they avoid the confusion of the this keyword, stateless components are a big win. And with Redux's style, you can clearly declare what subset of state you want to expose to your container component. In traditional Flux, when you wire up a change listener to a store, the entire store's data is exposed. And finally, this previous point is important because by declaring carefully what specific data you need, Redux can give you performance improvements behind the scenes. It will make sure that your component only renders when the specific data you've connected changes. This helps avoid wasteful, unnecessary re-renders and saves you from having to manually suppress renders via shouldComponentUpdate. Alright, now let's explore the two arguments that we pass to connect, mapState to props and mapDispatch to props.